Hello everyone. Welcome to Visual Radio. It is the 14th of February, which I guess means it's Valentine's Day, which is why there's a lot of red behind me. And tonight my guest is Shannon Liss-Riordan. But before we start our show, attorney Shannon Liss-Riordan, I just want to thank the Winchester Public Library for some of these books. Some are mine and some of the libraries. They're great people, and they've got a lot of events. And coming up at the Winchester Public Library, right up the street from us, Wednesday, March 20th, 7 p.m., Cape Cod author Michael J. Tugias presents a PowerPoint presentation about his January 2013 published book, A Storm Too Soon. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you.
A Storm Too Soon was last weekend. How'd you do with the storm?
Oh, we did fine. A little shoveling, but it was good.
We did a lot of shoveling in Medford, and then the guy who does our lawn, he did the snow blowing thing the next day, and we live at the top of a street, so you want to make sure your neighbors can
get by.
You know, so how long have you been practicing law?
Since 1998, so going on 15 years.
Very nice. And what do you specialize in?
I'm a wage and hour lawyer, so I represent workers. Most of my clients are low-income workers who have wage issues with their employers.
And now with the State of the Union speech the other night, the president's talking about wages.
Yes.
How does that impact you and your clients?
Yes, well, it was very exciting that the president was talking about raising the minimum wage. Many of my clients are at the minimum wage. I represent a lot of tipped workers who actually work for less than the minimum wage because they get the employer takes a tip credit against the minimum wage. So raising the minimum wage could have a big impact on a lot of people.
Do you mind if I ask about that? Because we were in a restaurant last night, and so they get a less than minimum wage. I don't understand how that can work.
Well, there's a federal law and there are state laws about how tipped employees are to be paid, and the idea is that employer can take what's called a tip credit against the minimum wage for workers who are expected to receive tips. That's often waiters, waitresses, and other types of employees. But what a lot of people don't know is that in order to take the tip credit and pay, for example, the minimum wage now in Massachusetts is $8 an hour, but tipped employees can be paid the tipped wage of $2.63 an hour as long as certain rules are followed about their tips. Like they have to be able to keep all of their tips. They can't be required to share their tips with managers. They can't be required to share their tips with back of the house non-tipped employees. So what we've seen a lot of times is that employers try to use waitstaff's tips to offset all these other expenses, to pay managers, to pay kitchen staff. And if they do that, they run into big trouble when they see a case from someone like me, because what happens is if you take the tip credit but you don't follow those rules, you have to turn around and go back and pay all the workers the full minimum wage. So that can add up to quite a bit when employers don't follow the rules closely.
Hey Jeff, can we have the straight on camera? And I don't know why the lighting seems very dark. Maybe we can change from the red. That's much better, much better. And these single cameras, I don't like where they are. So sorry people out there, but I have to do a little directing here from the chair, because when we're talking to each other and the cameras aren't catching us. So we can either keep it to the straight camera, Jeff, or we can move these cameras a little to get our faces. But that's fascinating because, Shannon, just as an outsider, I would think you pay waitresses and waiters minimum wage. And if they get paid a tip, God bless them. In a perfect world.
Well, in a perfect world, in some states, that is how it is. In California, for instance, employers can't take a tip credit for tipped employees. They have to pay the minimum wage and the employees have to keep their tips. In most states, though, they can pay somewhat less than the minimum wage, this tip credit wage. But again, as long as they follow all of the rules very closely for taking the tip credit. And a lot of restaurant employers just haven't followed those rules because they see the waiters and waitresses making so much money in tips. They think that they can use some of that to spread it around. And
hold on, Jeff. I'm going to direct the show people. I want this camera closer. I want this camera on Shannon, and I want this camera on me. Do you mind that? No, not on me, on both of us. Great. That's excellent, thank you. And this camera should be for the guest. And thank you, people. This is fascinating stuff. And I appreciate that you came all the way out here to Medford. Now, can we talk about where your law office is?
Yes, we're in Boston.
Oh, near...
Not too far from Government Center. We're at 100 Cambridge Street.
Oh, and how many lawyers are at the firm?
We have 9 lawyers and a staff of 7. So we have it's a small firm, but it's a pretty big sized firm for the type of work that we do.
Excellent. Jeff Dearman's an excellent director, but I like changing things in midstream sometimes, and that's just me. And everyone knows my show is very laid back. And I just teach public access from the live radio show. Do you basically, the whole firm basically focuses on wage and...
Yes, well, we're an employee rights law firm, so we represent employees generally. We also represent some labor unions, but our specialty and what most of our practice is doing class action wage and hour cases.
So I did a Google on class action King Arthur, and King Arthur Flour comes up, so I guess there was class action against King Arthur Flour?
No, that was against a strip club. That was...
No, but I mean there's a separate King Arthur suit, I guess, for the King Arthur Flour.
I'm not aware of that one.
Yeah,
I'm not,
but yours is
yes.
King Arthur's, the notorious club in Chelsea.
Yes. That was that was the first case. That was the first case in Massachusetts, I believe, against a strip club on behalf of the strippers. And what we did was we challenged the misclassification of the strippers as independent contractors, because throughout the strip club industry, clubs it's kind of a backwards system for how the dancers get paid. They don't actually get paid. They often have to pay in order to work. So for instance, they'll charge what's called a shift fee. They might have to pay $20, $50, $75 or $100 even just to work a shift. And then they get tips, but then they also have to tip out a number of other types of employees like DJs, sometimes managers, sometimes bartenders. So that was the first case that we did challenging that system because...
The women, the exotic dancers had
Yes.
to pay the DJs?
Yes, that's the way it has typically worked at a lot of clubs, and it's just...
It's almost like
not
they're
right.
the employers.
Well, that's the way they did. That's the way they structured them. We said, no, the dancers are actually employees of the club, and they can't be required to pay to work. They have to get paid to work, and they should get to keep all of their tips. So
that makes sense.
That makes sense. That's what most people would probably think. But it was kind of a perverse system that they have to pay to come in and work. I mean, imagine at a restaurant, if a waiter has to pay to work for a shift because, he'll get a lot of tips during the shift. No one would think that makes sense.
And that is a fair comparison. Really, a waiter and an exotic dancer.
It is, because both of them are tipped employees and they're expected to get tips, and they do get tips. But that doesn't mean that the employer doesn't have to pay anything in base wage. If they follow all of these tip rules that I was describing, they can pay what's called the tipped minimum wage. In Massachusetts, they can pay $2.63 an hour. But if they don't follow the rules, and if they make the dancers, for instance, pay over a portion of their tips to the house, or tip out employees that aren't service employees, then they can't take the tip credit. And the workers would have to get at least $8 an hour, plus be able to keep all of their tips.
Now, to me, it seems that the workers who are paying if the workers are paying a fee in order to work, a shift fee, and then they're paying like the DJ, they're kind of like renting the place like a concert hall or something. So they're basically the employer.
Well, that's what the clubs have claimed. Some of the clubs have said that really what the dancers are doing is they're paying rent, and they're tenants who are just renting a pole, and the courts just haven't gone for that. So the King Arthur's case was the first case I argued and won, and we got a court ruling that the dancers were in fact employees, not independent contractors, and as a result they have to get paid minimum wage and get to keep their tips. And then that case set off a whole series of other cases against other strip clubs, and we've sued a number of strip clubs since then. And I think word is getting out. I think the industry is changing because they all just did it that way because that's how everyone did it.
Oh, so there was a model that they all kind of followed.
Yes.
And since
Yes.
no one was complaining,
Exactly, and that's kind of been our specialty, which is that we see a model that's being used throughout an industry, but just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean it's legal, and we've been challenging a number of those models.
or even fair.
Exactly.
This is fascinating. So where do you argue this? So if King Arthur's in Chelsea, you're taking it to federal court?
That was in state court. A lot of these cases are in state court, some are in federal court.
Do you go into Boston?
Yeah.
The state court in Boston?
Yeah, well, yes, there's Suffolk Superior Court, which is right by our office. There are other courts.
Oh, it's a Superior Court you go to?
Yes. Middlesex, Superior Court, Essex. So we travel all around, and we're in federal court, and our firm actually has a national practice. So we're doing cases around the country. We're concentrated here in Massachusetts, but we have cases all over the place now.
Wow, can you talk about a case that's somewhere else? Like any other state that you can discuss? You don't have to.
Oh, no, we have cases in Florida, for instance. We have cases in Hawaii. Because of this specialty that we've developed on behalf of service workers, there are a lot of hospitality workers in Hawaii, places like Hawaii and Florida, big hotels that are not paying out all of the tips to wait staff. It's a pretty prevalent problem.
And tips are such a nebulous thing, are such a nebulous thing. A good worker is going to get more, a great waiter, and people, maybe a shy waiter who's really good but not really personable might not get as much money. So you really need protection.
Well, you need protection because if you work for tips, tips are your wages. So I think for a long time a lot of employers didn't really recognize that, and they saw tips as being some kind of extra, some kind of bonus. But the legislatures have passed laws saying that tips are wages for service employees, and there are special protections for them, so the employer can't dig into them and try to use them for other costs.
Interesting. I have a good attorney who helps me with contracts. And we went to lunch and he goes, give a good tip. And he's just really adamant about it. So now I know why. Lawyers seem to know that what these people are really earning. And I don't think the general public understands. I certainly don't. I just assumed a waiter or waitress got a minimum wage. I just assumed it.
Right. Well, another thing that people don't think about a lot, and it comes up in many of our cases, is when gratuities are added to the bill. There are laws in different places, and there's a law in Massachusetts in particular that says that if a service charge is added to the bill, that has to go in full to the wait staff also. We've had many cases in which restaurants, hotels, country clubs, catering establishments don't pay out the full proceeds of service charges to the wait staff. They take a part of it to fund their own operations. They use some of it to pay the management. They use some of it to pay a banquet coordinator. They use it for all types of things. But the law here in Massachusetts is pretty strict about that. If there's a service charge or anything that looks like a gratuity that's on a bill, it has to get paid to the wait staff.
Let me ask what the gratuity is. If that's like you're playing with a credit card and you put on the credit card bill like $10 as a tip. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's a tip. If you write in $10, that has to go to the waiter or waitress. Yes,
okay, good.
That has to. And in Massachusetts, the law is clear that a service charge is a tip. So even if the gratuity is included in by the establishment, that has to go to the wait staff. And so then
that's great.
So we've gotten into all this kind of game playing because I started doing these cases about 10 or 12 years ago, challenging employers that would put a service charge on the bill but then not pay it out to the wait staff. Like a lot of times what they'll do is they'll say, oh, we're paying a higher hourly rate because, so they don't need to get that service charge because instead of paying $2.63 an hour, we're paying $10 an hour or $12 an hour or $14 or $15 an hour or even more. But it doesn't matter because if they put something on the bill that looks like a service charge, the law says it has to go to the wait staff.
Service. The person giving the service.
Because otherwise, customers in the food and beverage industry would most likely leave a tip. But if you see a service charge already added, you think, oh, the tip's included, so I don't need to reach into my pocket or add a little more on at the end of the night. So that's a protective law that protects workers who work at banquet events, restaurants, hotels, and it's pretty important and has been flouted so many times by so many employers.
You were on Boston Neighborhood Network?
Yes.
Was that when they were at the Transportation Building, or now they're in Roxbury? They broadcast this show, so I've been over there.
Yes, I thought it was out of BU, if I'm not mistaken.
BU has their own, they could have taped at BU because BU has a whole telecommunications building. WTBU, then of course 90.9 is out of there, I think, or unless they moved over to Brighton. But so you had the full studio. What do you think of our little place here?
It's nice. It's very nice.
We love it. It's just really a good environment to have creative people exchange ideas. So class action lawsuit, I would think now with a good track record, if someone gets a class action suit, they're going to be like chilled. Like maybe it's time to settle right away. Do you ever get that kind of like, let's talk?
Well, it varies. Every case is a little different. Some places will try to settle quickly. Other places will fight it for a while, and we may spend years in court. And you just never know going into a case whether it's going to be one that will resolve quickly or whether it's going to be a long haul.
Now, I wonder if any of the businesses, and this is really out in left field, but when people play music in a restaurant, if it's large enough, they have to pay BMI or ASCAP or CSAC. Do the establishments ever come to you and want to fight paying the music bill?
I haven't had too many establishments come to me asking me for legal advice.
Okay. Sometimes, when the attorney's fighting them, then they say, hey, I have this issue and it's kind of similar, but it's now I'm on the other end of it.
I haven't heard that. I haven't heard that one.
Because some of the restaurants don't want to, I'm a musician, and so if you have a hit record, they have to pay into BMI, Broadcast Music Inc., or ASCAP, and I don't know if you know how that works, and then they get a royalty to the artists. And for the smaller venues, it's very difficult, but for the larger venues, sure, they should, pay the licensing fee. But so a lot of the restaurants are up in arms sometimes over having to pay a quarterly fee. I just thought I'd throw that in there. As you can see, some of these are music law books. So the class action suit itself, is there anything outside of the service industry? Someone comes to you with a class action suit, like, I know a neighbor of mine said, there should be a class action suit for parking meters. There's no parking enforcement in Medford. And a neighbor of mine said there should be a class action suit so that the citizens can get the revenue that we're losing out from not having parking enforcement. Does that make any sense?
That's interesting. Well, our specialty is class action suits on behalf of employees. So I do get people talking to me all the time about a potential class action suit for consumers, or you buy some kind of product that doesn't work or that was malfunctioning, and there are a lot of cases like that out there. That's just not our specialty. We're really focused on labor law and employment law, and in the service industry. I really got started in this area because of my work for service workers, particularly in food and beverage. But another big part of our practice that we focus on now is independent contractor misclassification, which happens in so many different industries, and it's a real scourge on those industries where it happens, because you have workers there who they really are employees, but because they're being called independent contractors, they're not eligible for workers' comp if they get injured, or unemployment if they lose their jobs, and because the employers call them independent contractors, they don't care about whether or not they're getting even minimum wage or overtime when they work more than 40 hours a week. And most terribly, what happens with independent contractor misclassification is that employers, just like we were talking about with the strip clubs, they actually charge employees to work, but they do it under the guise of them being independent contractors. So for instance, the strippers have to pay shift fees to go to work, or truck drivers have to pay for their truck and have to pay for insurance in order to work. And I've done a series of lawsuits over the last 5-7 years against a bunch of cleaning companies that call themselves cleaning franchise companies.
Oh.
And what they do is they basically sell jobs to workers. A lot of the workers are immigrant workers. Many of them don't speak English as their first language. and they think they're buying the American dream, and they'll charge them $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 to buy a cleaning job.
Whoa.
And they say they're independent contractors, so it's okay to sell it to them. And I've gotten rulings from the federal court that you can't do that, that what they're doing is selling a job to workers, and you can't do that.
That's totally amazing. Well, you know that writers get paid per job, and so you could be working for a company. You might get 30 assignments, but you're an independent contractor. And then that way they can let you go at any time when they've had enough of your flavor, and then they get a flavor from another writer. And it's a real grind because there's no job security, there's no insurance, and the wages are usually low, you know, unless you're writing for national magazines. And so there's a lot of pockets of independent contractors that need unions or something.
Yes. Well, that's another reason why employers want to call workers independent contractors, so they can't form a union. So we see that a lot in the trucking industry, for instance.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yes.
So in the trucking industry, they shy away from unions.
Well, the employers don't want the truck drivers to unionize, so they say they're independent contractors. So then if they do try to organize, they have to go and prove that they're actually employees so that they can organize. They have to go to the National Labor Relations Board and say, actually, we're employees. So we've been involved in some of those fights.
And the bigger the company, the bigger the corporation, the more clout they might have with the political climate.
Well, yes, there are a lot of corporations that are not very happy about what we're doing because we're calling them to task for the way they are charging workers for jobs and really trying to shift all of their expenses onto the workers. Because that's the whole way this unsettles the whole employment system. You know, there are just some basic rights that employees have, you know, the right to be paid minimum wage, right to be paid overtime unless you're exempt from overtime, the right to get unemployment if you lose your job, or workers' comp if you get injured, and the right, most importantly, I think, the right not to have to pay to do your job. So employers have been making tons of profits by abusing the system and misclassifying workers as independent contractors, and we're really taking them to task for that. And we've made some pretty serious inroads in a number of industries.
So how did the King Arthur's case come to your attention?
I had a client, actually it was a client who was one of my cleaning worker clients who had a girlfriend who worked at one of these clubs, and he brought her in and said, you know, have you thought about how this is actually happening in the strip club industry? And that was the first I had seen of this. And I said, that's really interesting, so let's do the case.
Oh.
And we did the case, and it became a groundbreaking case.
Now that's fascinating. So one of your other clients saw another injustice.
Yes.
Okay, now, when you decided we're going to take the case, how many other dancers did you need to sign on?
You only need one.
I didn't know that.
To start a class action case, one person can start a case on behalf of all of their other coworkers. If everyone has been treated the same, has been subject to the same policy that's illegal, we can file a class action case if one person comes to us. I mean, oftentimes in these cases we'll have more than one, we'll have a handful of representatives, but technically you only need one to get started.
Can I ask how many were in the Arthur's case?
I think there were in all about 70 dancers.
70?
Yes.
Oh my God. That blows my mind because I just figured 15, 20.
Well, you know, there's turnover in these kinds of jobs. People might work for a little while, they might work for a few months. You know, there might only be 15 or 20 working at a time, but over the course of 3 years, because when you file one of these cases, you can go back in time 3 years. There's often turnover, so there'll be more people than that involved.
I had a client who was an exotic dancer back in the 80s. And she said to me, I did PR work for her. And then she ended up managing a magazine and hired me to write. 2 decades later, which I thought was kind of funny. But I knew what she was doing, and she was a great singer, too. She was a really good performer. And I said, you know, you're one of the best performers in Boston. And then it turns out she was an exotic dancer. So of course, she was getting practice during the day. And then she said, you got to come see me tonight, Joe. I said, there's no way You're my friend now. I cannot go. It's only flesh. I said, I cannot go see you perform. Let's keep our friendship. I mean, I'd stay over a house in Jersey and everything. You had to keep that professional boundary. She thought it was all professional, and I'm happy I declined to this day.
Yeah.
Very beautiful woman. I'm happy I declined.
Yeah,
it changes your image of.
Yeah, it's a big business. It's a big business. People may have different views of the industry, but the truth is there are a lot of people who are making a living doing this, and there's just a lot of money that comes in. There's a lot of money that changes hands at these clubs. And before this, not too many people were really looking at the questions of how is the money changing hands, and are the workers actually getting the piece of it that they should be?
Fascinating stuff, and there is stigma against. I call them exotic dancers from the movie Independence Day. That's where the president's wife would say that to Will Smith's girlfriend. Oh, ballet, exotic. Oh, I'm sorry. She apologizes to her. The stigma seems to have gone away because it's an industry where there's some respect, and maybe because of your hard work. These are human beings doing their work, and there's a lot of money, so people want this service.
It is. I mean, we have clients who are feeding their kids on this work.
Right. The woman in Independence Day was, my child is worth it. Mm-hmm. No, so God bless you for doing the right thing for these people, and they're working hard. They should be paid their money.
They should be paid fairly. Exactly. Yes.
So now there are more cases in Massachusetts. But are there other cases that come out of these, like the cleaning person brought you the dancers? Mm-hmm. Do you find other cases now from the dancers saying, hey, what about this?
Yeah, well, yes, that happens. We'll sort of tap into a whole industry because someone comes to us and points out, hey, have you seen how this is happening there? And then we'll do one case and another case, and then it kind of unfolds into a number of others. So for instance, recently I started some cases against taxi cab companies. So we're representing cab drivers in Boston and in some other towns who are called independent contractors, and just like with the strippers, just like with the truck drivers, they have to pay to work. So in the city of Boston, cab drivers have to pay, many of the drivers are shift drivers, meaning they have to pay a shift fee to work.
Sounds familiar.
It is, yes. It's the same basic concept. There's an amount of money they have to pay just to get into their cab, and then they have to pay for gas. They have to pay for tolls if they don't have a passenger in the cab. There are other expenses they may have to pay. A number of companies charge them for insurance, and cab drivers can spend 12 hours driving a cab and not bring in enough money to pay all those expenses.
Oh my God.
And it happens every day.
Now, we live in Medford, and at the city council meetings, there are a lot of cab drivers coming up to city council in Medford and getting a license in Medford. And so the city council is now questioning, why are all these people from Boston coming to Medford? So it seems to be like a smaller fee for the license, and there seems to be a company that they use as an address. So the city council went over to the address and checked it out. But now there are things being tabled. It's really fascinating hearing all this, because we go to the council, myself and some colleagues, just to watch how our city works. And we see this whole taxi cab thing. So I don't know, I didn't know that was going on. Thank you for enlightening me. Anything that really inspired you in court? Any like really different story that you can tell on the air that you found really maybe fascinating to you as a lawyer?
There have been so many. There were the SkyCap cases that I spent a number of years on. I don't know if you know about those.
No.
What happened a number of years ago, it was around 2005, 2006, the airlines were looking for extra ways to make a little extra money, because the airlines, after 9/11, the airlines were trying to figure out how to frankly had a nickel and dime the public as much as they could to try to get back on their feet. And one of the bright ideas that someone in the airline industry came up with was they noticed that out on the curb, right outside the airport, there are sky caps who work there who help passengers check in their luggage. People who don't feel like lugging their luggage all the way inside, and they want to be able to check it right outside and get their boarding pass and not have to wait in the lines inside. So traditionally, passengers have used sky caps and they tip them. And that's how the sky caps make their living, is through tips from passengers. And what appears to have happened is some airline industry people were watching this and realized there's a lot of cash changing hands between passengers and sky caps, and somehow that cash isn't going to the airline. So
It's a lot of work going on.
it is. So one by one, the airlines started implementing, it was around 2006, a curbside check-in fee for these bags, and at the time it was $2 a bag.
I remember.
Which was the amount of a typical tip. So it looked to passengers like this was the SkyCaps tip. And a lot of passengers, they thought, oh, well, we used to be able to decide whether we tip you or how much we tip you, but now they put up a sign saying we have to tip you $2. So they would say, okay, here you go, here's your $2, thank you very much. They thought it was the same as it was before, it was just now mandatory. But that wasn't the case at all. SkyCaps weren't getting to keep the $2. It was going back into the coffers of the airlines. So,
Whoa.
so that was pretty dramatic to me when some SkyCaps came and talked to me about that, and I saw that that's right. I think passengers are paying it because they think that they're tipping you.
Can I ask if they were being paid minimum wage anyway?
They were not being paid minimum wage. They were, well, at the time they were taking the tip credit because the SkyCaps did get tips. But then when they started this $2 per bag charge, it was cutting into their tips because most people just paid the $2. They didn't pay anything extra. If they paid anything extra, it was very little. So the SkyCaps were devastated when the airlines started doing this because the airlines were just taking the money right out of their pocket.
And there's really little way you can say, I'm not getting paid, can you tip me? It's gauche and you can't do it.
You can't do it, and you can get fired for it. I mean, at a lot of jobs, employers don't want, for obvious reasons, they don't want their employees to be soliciting tips from customers. They just depend on customers' generosity and customs. So when I talk to people, I remind them a lot that the people who are working in service positions that you come across every day, waiters, waitresses, SkyCaps, taxi drivers, you don't think so much about that extra $1 or $2 or $5 or $10 that you might give them, but it really means a lot to them because those are the wages that they're counting on to feed their families, pay their rent, go to school, whatever it is they're doing.
And I'm going to tell people that in the future because I didn't know that. I assumed people are getting minimum wage. I just assumed it. And I think people feel good assuming things.
I think people assume that's the way they think it should be, and when they learn that that's not the way it is, I think it does change people's perceptions.
It's changed mine. I'm really thrilled you're on the show tonight just to get the word out because this is important. This is very important.
Yeah.
And
yeah, well, so a related topic is that the service charges that I told you about, it's something that people don't think about but should think about. If you say you go to a restaurant, you have a private party, maybe you're having a little dinner party, and so they add a service charge to your bill, or maybe you're planning a big party, you have a daughter who's getting married and you have a big banquet event for the wedding, and then there's a charge that's put on the bill at the end of the night. Most people are too polite to ask too many questions about that charge because they don't want to be embarrassed. They just think they're supposed to know what it goes to, and they just don't ask a lot of questions. And most people think that those charges are the service charge or the gratuity for the wait staff or whoever served at the event. And so they're unlikely to add a little extra onto it, or they might add a little extra onto it because they think most of the gratuity is already included. And the employers who tack these charges on want people to not ask questions. They want you to think, yeah, that's the gratuity, so don't worry about paying more for the wait staff. But in reality, the wait staff may not be getting that charge, or they may not be getting all the charge. They might be getting part of the charge. So something else that I encourage people to do is if you're in that situation and you see these charges added to your bill, ask what they are. Because if you find out that it's just another charge that's going back to the place that you paid all this money for the food, you can say, hey, I already paid you all this for the food, and now why am I paying you another 18%? So
They're going to have a response, aren't they?
Well, they'll sort of hem and haw. Sometimes they'll say, oh yeah, well, it takes care of the staff and covers other expenses, or they won't really come out and tell you. But if it's not all going to the staff, you should call them on it. And you should say, hey, I'm only going to pay that if you tell me it's going to the staff.
I went to pay my our Comcast bill for the house 2 weeks ago. And there's a long line, and it was a very long. They're shutting down some of the payment centers, so they're consolidating. They pay less staff, and there's a longer line. I counted 17 people, and I said, could I see the public file? Now, do you know what a public file is in media?
No.
You can write a letter to a radio station. Sports radio WEEI, Glenn Ordway was fired yesterday. But they're letting him stay on the air because they trust him, that he's not going to go bonkers. And he's getting a lot of credit for doing his last 3 days knowing he's fired. Tomorrow's his last day. But you could write to the public file, and I could say, hey, I, Joe Viglione, want Glenn Ordway to stay. Or I could say, hey, good man, 27 years, but it is time for a change. But you can write a positive or negative letter to the cable provider or to the radio station. Comcast had me wait 15 minutes, and they made an employee go into the back, and the line turned to 25 people, and we were just waiting and waiting, and I said, I can't wait. I'll come back another time. But they didn't want to show me the public file. And I was fascinated that they use techniques. So if you're asking about this gratuity fee, is it called?
Or a service charge.
Service charge. Mm-hmm. So they have these ways of making everyone punish for someone asking a question they, by law, have to answer. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a law, public file. You have to answer this. 15 minutes I waited. I timed them. Mm-hmm. I, of course, knew what I was doing, but, the bottom line is I didn't know they'd react that way. And I just wrote it down and walked out. But it's fascinating how upper management has these ways of dealing with people who ask too many questions.
Right. Well, they depend on people not asking those questions.
I had a guest a couple of weeks ago, and he has 4 grandchildren, I think. And he said his wife has got the name of troublemaker because they want to know why the swings at one park are always good and the swings in another park are broken. And the wife will complain to City Hall, and she's called the troublemaker. And I was like, that's fascinating. So we're supposed to just take it and not go to a lawyer.
Right. Well, we often find that in our cases. A lot of times people will call us who they knew there was something wrong going on for a long time, maybe even years and years, but because they're working for a place, they don't want to rock the boat.
Yep.
They don't want to be a troublemaker. They don't want to risk their jobs, they fear, by coming forward. So a lot of times we'll have people who come to us because they're done with a job, they've quit, or they got fired, and now they're ready to make the complaint about. Or they may have a complaint that really is different. They're upset about being fired, for instance. We might talk to them and say, I know you're upset about being fired. You don't really have a legal challenge to that, but you know what? Your employer wasn't paying you correctly, and there's a big case here. And that's a lot of times how cases start. We do have a number of cases where employees who are still working for an employer will come forward. It's very brave of them, but they'll come forward, and if they file a wage complaint, they're protected from retaliation.
Wow.
So it would be illegal for the
Wow.
employer to lay a finger on them if they've filed a wage complaint. And in some ways it almost gives extra protection to them because the employer knows I got to be hands off because I'm really going to get into trouble if I do anything to this employee.
That is really good news because a lot of people are afraid of retaliation.
It's a big issue. It's a very big issue. And, I mean, in the cases we've had on behalf of exotic dancers, it's a significant issue. Obviously, it takes a lot of guts to challenge these establishments, and we've had very strong clients come forward who say, I'm going to stand up for what's right.
Now, I don't know much about the industry other than my friend was dancing back in the 80s. Do they go from club to club, and can they be blacklisted?
They do go from club to club, and word does get around, yes. So a lot of times it's people who are not working in an industry anymore who then feel that they can take, they're not as worried anymore about what that's going to mean. But at the same time, if someone works somewhere and they they have a lawsuit, say, against one employer, and then they go try to work someplace else. And if they don't get hired because that employer found out they had a lawsuit against the other employer, that's illegal too. So we've had cases challenging that. But I do agree, it's a big problem that a lot of our clients are very nervous about stepping forward, but we try to reassure them there are laws that protect you, and we'll go to bat for you if anything happens to you.
And now let's take authors. Things, now that the case is over, everyone happy? Are things nice and smooth, maybe, in that world?
Well, I think that case started kind of a chain reaction among other clubs, and as a result, a lot of dancers have gotten a lot of money paid back to them. A lot of practices have changed at many of the clubs, and it's not 100% yet. There's still a lot of non-compliance out there. There's still a lot of clubs that haven't gotten the message, but by and large, what we're hearing, there are changes that are happening in that industry. And we're also quite excited about changes we're seeing happening in other industries where we've been making these inroads. And we're seeing employers change their model to calling their workers what they are, which is employees rather than independent contractors.
So I'm going to ask you some other questions about what you do. And like I said earlier, this show is about our guests. So if you don't like the questions, you don't have to answer them.
I'll make up my own.
You're free to do that too. You like to read law books? Are you reading law books?
I wish I could. I really spend most of my time reading legal briefs, and I've got 3 kids, so life is a little busy for me. I don't have as much time to read for pleasure as I wish I did.
Now, are the kids in school?
They are, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what do they think when mom goes to court when she wins? Is there a celebration?
I think that's pretty. They think it's pretty cool. They've come and watched me. Not my little one, but my others have come and watched me, and it's fun. It's fun to be able to explain to them what it is that I do, and show them who it is that we're fighting for. That it's working people.
Do they see mom as a judge sometimes, Your Honor? Do you get?
I don't get that too much.
Okay, so they pull rank and you're our mom. That's that.
Yes.
When you come home, you're mom.
Yes.
So legal briefs. Now, legal briefs, are they from your firm, or do you have to read just to look for precedent and such?
Well, I read decisions, court decisions. That's a lot of my time spent reading. What we're constantly doing is we're writing briefs. We're reading the employer's briefs, and we're writing our own briefs. Mm-hmm. So that's a big part of what we do. We're in court a lot. I'm in court every week. Most weeks I have court hearings
Just
where I'm
motions
making arguments.
Or?
Yeah, procedural, but motions. I spend a lot of time arguing in front of judges some pretty intense legal issues, and it's really exciting, and that's really what I love. I love what I do because I love helping people and making changes, systematic changes that I think can really affect people's lives, and the day-to-day aspect of it. I love being in court. I love making arguments to judges. I love having a trial and getting up in front of a jury and making an opening or closing statement and really plead a case to a jury and tell. The great thing about the jury system is that you can just talk to everyday people
John Q. Public
about
Doe.
legal issues, and they decide what's right. So it's really powerful to have clients who can get up in a courtroom and then in front of a jury present their case, and so I love that part of it too.
And with dancers, they're probably not intimidated by being on a witness stand because they've taken it all off in front of their customers. They can get in front of a courtroom and be more open, maybe.
Well, I had a client who's a dancer recently who testified at a hearing, and I said, I know you're going to be nervous. It's always nerve-wracking getting up there. And she said, I take off my clothes in front of strangers for a living. I think I'll be okay. I said, you're right. I think you'll be okay. And
see, I must be psychic. I figured that out. It's and now law is all over TV. I mean, Law and Order SVU, Law and Order Criminal Intent, Law and Order Regular, which I think is a really well done show and really well written, although it's expensive for TV, which is why we're getting all this reality stuff. But what you do is important, and I'm so pleased that you came out here tonight to share your stories with us, because
thank you.
This is just good community stuff that people need to know, that your waiters and waitresses aren't getting the money you might imagine they're getting, and I guess we just can't take for granted people that are in the service industry. You know,
That's right.
some of the fast food chains train their people on the job, so they have little cheat cards, and you can actually see someone trying to learn how to make your sandwich for you, and I think that's so wrong. Train a person, and then they're dealing with the public, and it's a little known secret of that industry that they're training people on the job. I think they should pay a worker for the training and then put them out there when they've been properly trained. I mean, we're access producers. We join an access station, but we are taught how to use cameras, how to edit, how to film, but we're volunteers, and this is a fun thing we do. People that are getting paid and that's their job, I don't know, especially handling food. I want someone trained to handle my food. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So, any precedent you found that you said, that's interesting? I don't think people have seen this in a while.
Well, there is a big area that I'm spending a lot of my time fighting in court now. It's a really important area. It doesn't get a whole lot of media attention because it might seem a little legalistic, but it's actually really, really important, and that has to do with forced arbitration, which is basically what companies do now, and they do it so that they don't get sued. They do it to try to keep their employees from suing them, and they also try to do it to keep consumers from suing them. And they put in these contracts this really tiny print that no one ever reads, and that you couldn't read even if you tried to, because it just doesn't make any sense. They put all of these provisions in these contracts that basically are keeping people from coming together and bringing a lawsuit against them. So in other words, they know that in the cases that we do, the wage and hour cases we do, for any one employee, the amount of money that they're owed because of the wage violation, it's a lot to them. It may not necessarily be enough to merit a lawyer or starting up a whole lawsuit over it. So it's because employees can come together and challenge these policies that it makes these lawsuits worthwhile to do and financially viable to do. So these companies, what they've been trying to do is force employees to have to go to arbitration if they want to bring a claim, and say that one by one everyone would have to challenge it individually. And they know that most people aren't going to do that. And it's just a cost of doing business to pay off the 1 or 2 or 3 or even 10 people who go through the trouble of doing it, while they're making money by not paying the hundreds of people who are subject to the policy. So a lot of my time recently, a lot of what our firm has been doing, a lot of firms like ours around the country are challenging these forced arbitration clauses that are trying to stop people from being able to band together and make these challenges. And unfortunately, the courts the Supreme Court has really not been good on this issue. The Supreme Court is allowing employers and companies to go further and further to put these fine print agreements in these contracts that no one will ever read and strip away people's rights. And it's a big problem. We're really hoping that Congress will step in and do something about it. It sounds a little esoteric, but because of these arbitration clauses, a lot of these cases could be really difficult to bring in the future.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm going to talk to our movie guy now. I want to tell everyone that you had a nice congratulations on the Globe article in December. It's called Attorney Former Workers to Bid for Upper Crust. It's worth checking out. We're going to talk to Frank Dell'Istrito. I've got one last question as I dial him. And do you mind staying as we talk to Frank?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Disclosure. Did you see the movie Disclosure?
I did not.
Demi Moore? They have a mediation, which is actually a forced arbitration. But I thought of that when you brought that up. Michael Douglas sues Demi Moore in Disclosure.
Trio, talking about movies.
Hey, Frank. Welcome to the show.
How you doing, Joe?
Good.
How did you come through the big blizzard?
We did okay. We did okay here in Boston.
That's good. We, usually when there's bad weather, it's calls coming from the East Coast down to Texas asking about the hurricanes. And this year, it's been the calls have been going the other way. We've been calling about Sandy and then about the superstorm.
Say hi to Shannon, my guest tonight.
All right, how you doing, Shannon?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
All right?
He's in Texas. And we're talking Alfred Hitchcock.
We are.
Our series continues.
That's right. Let's see. Last week we talked about The Manx Man, which I believe you're showing tomorrow night. And tonight we're talking about The Ring. This is another silent movie. This is Hitchcock's fourth film. 9 silent movies. Last week's the movie you're showing tomorrow night that we discussed last week is The Manx Man, which is his last silent movie. And this is the only movie that he wrote an original screenplay for. And he did a lot of writing. You know, he and his wife were often heavily involved in the scripts of his movies, but he never took a screenplay credit for an original screenplay again. And everything he had worked on after this, I believe, was an adaptation from a book or a play or something else. And the hypothesis is he had no trouble with the visuals, but dialogue didn't come naturally to him. So when sound movies came in, basically he put his career of writing original screenplays on the shelf and decided he would do adaptations and get help with the dialogue thereafter.
Fascinating.
We often talk about on this show about how silent movies ended and sound came in and that killed a lot of careers. And unfortunately, sometimes it killed people literally. And the star of tonight's show, star of the movie we're discussing tonight, which we'll be showing next week, is a woman named Lillian Hall Davis, who we've seen her a few weeks ago in The Farmer's Wife. She was very good in that movie. She's very good in this movie. But sound is coming in and will kill her career, and she will commit suicide in 1933, 6 years after this movie's made, because her career just went downhill and had nowhere to go, and she was so despondent she took her own life.
That's horrible.
Yeah, but I mean, there's dozens of stories of like that in this era, where people who were famous, making very good money, and overnight their careers were gone.
It's almost Hitchcockian.
Yes, it's rather Hitchcockian. And one might say this movie is not quite Hitchcockian, because as we discussed last week, in this stage of his career, he is making movies about love triangles, unhappy loves. Last week's movie I always get confused at the time. The movie we discussed last week that you're showing tomorrow is a love triangle story, and nobody at the end of that movie is happy. I'm not going to give away any of the plot, but on this movie, but I guarantee you a happier ending than the movie they'll watch tomorrow night.
And just to get everyone clear on it, it's going to be The Manx Man on the 15th, tomorrow night at 9 o'clock here at Wingham. And on the 22nd, we're playing Hitchcock's The Ring, his, what again is it? The final movie that he wrote entirely.
The movie he ever wrote,
Only
one. Only original screenplay he ever wrote. Everything else was an adaptation.
Fascinating. And I interrupted your train of thought, but that was important.
Okay. Let's see. The movie you're showing tomorrow night stars a Dane actor named Carl Brisson, and he is also in the movie we're discussing tonight, The Ring. And again, nobody's heard of him. He was doing quite well in silent films, but once sound came in, his Danish accent couldn't make it, and so he went off. I think he spent the rest of his career in Denmark, but you won't hear of him again. So I think, Joe, you're the only guy that can claim you've shown Carl Brisson movies back to back. So congratulations. And Carl Brisson made 2 Hitchcock movies, and you're showing one tomorrow night and one next week, which is The Ring.
And Arnold Schwarzenegger thanks us for that.
Yes, okay, yeah. And the third part of the love triangle is an English actor, Ian Hunter, who we Americans who watched 1930s and 40s film tend to associate with kings. He played King Richard in Errol Flynn's Robin Hood movie, and he played King Edward in the Boris Karloff Basil Rathbone Tower of London. And he was kind of a standby British actor who picked up a lot of roles in Hollywood in the 40s. And Hitchcock, the title The Ring.
10 seconds.
Okay, The Ring, it's a boxing movie, but it's also got a wedding ring in it. Love triangle.
Thank you,
I'll
Frank.
talk to you next week when I think we're showing The Saboteur. Bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye. Thanks. And that's Frank Delestrito, the views and opinions on Visual Radio. Live are those of the host and his guests, and not necessarily those of WinCam, its board of directors, staff,
volunteers. And thanks to Jeff Dearman, our director. Thanks to Gene Martin, our assistant. Thank you to Shannon for being on our show. Thank you to Judy Kellerman and to WinCam. We have some sports guests next week. We're going to have a lot of fun. And we have Manel Suri coming in next week in the studio. We'll be broadcasting that live. 5 seconds. Thank you, WinCam. Tomorrow night, Manxman, Hitchcock. Good night.